This is Persia. Not the Persia of sword clashes and cavalry charges, but the quieter empire, the one that understood something Rome never quite grasped. That to truly conquer a people, you don't just take their land. You take their future. You marry their daughters. You erase their bloodlines from the inside out, and you do it all beneath a veneer of honor so perfect, so glittering with ceremony, that historians would spend centuries debating whether it was mercy or monstrosity. The year is 539 BCE, and Babylon, the city that had stood for 1,000 years, whose ziggurats pierced the clouds and whose kings claimed descent from gods, has just fallen. But there are no screams, no rivers of blood. The gates swing open almost gently, and Cyrus the Great enters not as a destroyer, but as a liberator, torch in hand, proclaiming religious freedom and restoration. The cylinder of Cyrus, discovered centuries later, would immortalize this moment as one of humanity's first declarations of human rights. Yet behind that proclamation, in the rooms where lamplight never quite reaches, another kind of conquest was already unfolding. King Nabonidus, Babylon's last ruler, was spared execution. His temples were honored. His gods received offerings. But his family, his wives, his daughters, the women who carried Babylon's royal blood in their veins, they were invited to Susa, to Persepolis, to the heart of the Persian court, where marble corridors whispered with 100 different languages and the air smelled of myrrh imported from lands whose names had already been forgotten. They were told they were being honored. They were dressed in robes worth a province's taxes. They were given titles that sounded like blessings. And then, quietly, deliberately, they disappeared from every record that mattered. This was the Persian harem. The word itself means forbidden or sacred, and it was the empire's most sophisticated weapon. Historians have obsessed over Persian military tactics, their roads, their postal system, the way they administered satrapies across 3 continents. But they've spent far less time examining the architecture of control that existed behind the veiled doors of the royal household. Here, in rooms that only eunuchs and the king could enter, the future of entire civilizations was being rewritten 1 generation at a time. Consider what happens when a conquered princess enters these halls. She is perhaps 17, draped in silk dyed with Tyrian purple, her wrists heavy with gold. She has been told she is blessed among women, chosen by the King of Kings himself. Persian officials bow as she passes. Servants scatter rose petals before her feet. The ceremony of her arrival is recorded in clay tablets found millennia later. 10 measures of barley for the daughter of the Lydian king, now of the royal house. But her name isn't recorded, not once. Her face is never carved into the endless processions that march across Persepolis's walls, where Medes and Elamites and Egyptians bring tribute in eternal submission. She has become a commodity, measured in grain rations, her identity reduced to her father's kingdom and her current status, property of the throne. The genius of this system reveals itself slowly, like poison working through a bloodstream. She will bear children. If fortune favors her, she might bear a son. That son will speak Persian as his first language. He will worship Ahura Mazda, the Persian god of truth and light. He will learn to ride and shoot arrows in the Persian style, and when he looks at maps, he will see the world as Persians see it, a garden that his father tends, with rebellion as the weed that must be pulled. If that son ever returns to his mother's homeland, he will return as a Persian prince, not a native king. The conquest is complete. The bloodline has been turned against itself. Archaeological evidence reveals the scale of this operation with chilling precision. In the Persepolis Fortification Archive, a collection of over 30,000 clay tablets documenting the administrative minutiae of empire, researchers have found entry after entry referencing women identified only by their origin: the Egyptian woman, the Babylonian, she who came from Sardis. These weren't courtesans or slaves in the traditional sense. They were royal captives, living treaties, their bodies the ink in which diplomatic agreements were written. One tablet matter-of-factly notes provisions for the children of the royal women who are not of Persian birth. Even the children were categorized, forever marked by the foreign blood in their veins. Herodotus, writing a generation after Persia's zenith, claimed that Persian kings kept 360 concubines, one for each day of the year according to the Egyptian calendar they'd adopted. The number is almost certainly exaggerated, shaped by Greek fascination with Eastern excess. But the principle behind it is accurate. The harem wasn't about pleasure. It was about possession, the systematic accumulation of conquered people's most precious resource, their dynastic legitimacy. At Persepolis, the ruins still whisper what the official histories won't say. Stand in the Apadana, the great audience hall where envoys from 23 nations once brought tribute to the throne, and study the reliefs carefully. You'll see Armenians bringing horses, Indians with jars of gold dust, Ethiopians with ivory tusks. Each delegation is rendered in meticulous detail. Their clothing, their gifts, their posture of submission. But scan the entire complex, every carved surface that survived Alexander's burning, and count the women depicted. In scenes of royal ceremony, you'll find almost none. When they do appear, they're faceless, generic figures in the background, their features worn smooth by time or perhaps by intent. This erasure was deliberate. Persian imperial ideology required the king to be the sole source of legitimacy, the axis around which the empire revolved. To depict a queen too prominently might suggest divided authority. To immortalize a foreign bride might remind conquered peoples of what they'd lost. Better to let them vanish into a prestigious silence, their names dissolving like salt in water. Yet, even in that silence, some women learned to accumulate power. The king's mother, the queen mother, often wielded influence that rivaled ministers and generals. Parysatis, mother of Artaxerxes II, dominated Persian politics for decades, orchestrating the execution of her son's wife and manipulating succession crises with ruthless precision. But notice how even her power operated. Entirely through others, always from behind the curtain, her commands carried by eunuchs whose very bodies symbolized the harem's separation from the world of men. She ruled a shadow state that overlapped the visible empire, and her weapons were whispers, poisons, and the strategic placement of favorites in her son's bed. The Persians understood something profound about power, that its most effective forms are often invisible. A king could parade his armies, build monuments that scraped the sky, carve his victories into mountain faces. But the quiet absorption of enemy bloodlines required no monuments. It happened in lamplight and silk, in the careful selection of which captive princess would sleep in which chamber, in the meticulous record-keeping that noted every royal birth and ensured that sons of foreign mothers were raised as Persians first and foremost. This is why the story of what happened to defeated warriors' wives is more disturbing than simple violence. Violence has a beginning and an end. This was transformation, the slow, inexorable conversion of identity itself. A Babylonian princess might spend her entire life in the Persian court, surrounded by luxury that would have awed her father's palace, and never once set foot outside the harem's prescribed boundaries. She would see the king perhaps a handful of times in her life. She would raise children who regarded her homeland as a foreign country. She would die without a monument, her grave unmarked or marked only with Persian titles that erased where she came from. Clay tablets from Susa record something even more chilling, a bureaucracy built around this erasure. Rations withheld from the house of the queen by order of the king. One reads, offering no explanation. Was this punishment? Had someone fallen from favor? Or was it simply the empire's casual reminder that even queens existed at the king's pleasure, their survival dependent on his continued approval? Another tablet lists, the woman from Bactria, removed from the royal house. Removed how? Exiled? Executed? Married off to a minor official as a deliberate humiliation? The clay preserves the action, but not the story. leaving only the skeleton of control. Then there are the stories that survive precisely because they were so shocking that even Persian discretion couldn't contain them. Herodotus tells of Amestris, wife of Xerxes, who discovered her husband had taken a mistress, the wife of Xerxes' own brother, a woman of notable beauty and noble blood. The affair itself wasn't unusual. Persian kings were expected to have multiple partners. But Amestris saw in it a challenge to her position, a crack in the order she maintained. So she waited. She waited until the proper moment, until the sacred festival where the king was required to grant any request she made. And then she asked for the woman. What followed was so brutal that Greek historians recorded it in visceral detail, perhaps embellishing, but perhaps not. The woman was mutilated. Her nose, ears, lips, tongue, and breasts cut away, and then sent back to her family, a living message about the price of attracting royal attention. Her body became a text written in scar tissue, each wound a word in a sentence about power and consequence. Scholars debate whether this actually happened. The story fits too neatly into Greek stereotypes about Persian cruelty, about Eastern despotism, and the dangerous power of barbarian queens. But even if it's partially invented, it reveals something true, that within the Persian court, the human body was understood as a medium for communication. Mutilation wasn't random violence, it was a language. When rebels were impaled, when traitors had their tongues removed, it symbolized the silencing of defiance, the physical manifestation of political order restored. The same logic would apply to a woman who disrupted the harem's hierarchy. To destroy her beauty was to destroy her power, to make her simultaneously visible and invisible. A warning everyone could see, but no one could be. The absence of her name in Persian records is its own kind of testimony. If this happened, the empire chose not to remember it officially. The clay tablets continue their mundane tallies of grain and wine, of provisions delivered and children born, as if nothing had occurred. But the story spread anyway, carried by Greek merchants and Persian defectors, traveling across the empire as a whispered warning about what happened when the order behind the curtains was threatened. At Behistun, carved into a cliff face so high that no ordinary person could reach it to deface it, Darius the Great proclaimed his legitimacy to the heavens. The inscription, written in 3 languages, describes his suppression of 9 rebel kings who rose against him when he seized the throne. Each rebel is named, his lineage given, his lies detailed. The relief shows them bound, defeated, their postures broken. Above them all hovers Ahura Mazda, blessing Darius's rule, its propaganda elevated to theology, the claim that resistance to Persian power wasn't just illegal but cosmically wrong, a lie against truth itself. Yet nowhere in that massive inscription, nowhere in its 2,200 lines of cuneiform text is a single rebel's wife or daughter mentioned. They existed. Of course they existed. When you execute or exile a king, his family doesn't simply evaporate. But in Darius's cosmology, they weren't worth recording. Their fate was predetermined by their husband's rebellion. They would be absorbed into the Persian system, their children raised to serve the throne their fathers had challenged. Their silence in the inscription is more total than death. Death at least leaves a grave. This left nothing. This is the dark truth the title promises, but that's more complex than simple cruelty. The Persians didn't brutalize defeated warriors' wives in the way that other ancient empires did. They didn't massacre them or sell them en masse into slavery. Instead, they did something more insidious. They offered them honor. They dressed them in silk and gold. They called them queens and favorites and mothers of princes. And in doing so, they erased them more completely than any conqueror who simply put cities to the sword. Consider the psychological architecture of this system. A captive princess raised in Babylon to believe her bloodline was divine, that her family had ruled since before memory, is brought to Persepolis. She walks through the gate of all nations, where stone bulls with human faces stare down at her with knowing eyes. She sees tribute-bearers from every corner of the world, frozen in stone, eternally approaching the throne. She's led through corridors where the walls themselves seem to breathe with power, where every surface is polished to mirror brightness, where she can't take a step without seeing her reflection multiplied, fragmented, lost in the empire's overwhelming grandeur. And then she's told, "You are blessed. You have been chosen. Your children will be princes. Your lineage will continue. All you must do is forget. Forget your language, speak Persian now. Forget your gods. Ahura Mazda watches over you. Forget your father's house. The King of Kings is your family now. Most of all, forget who you were, because that person no longer matters." The kingdom she came from becomes a distant dream, something that happened to someone else. Some resisted, surely. Some women must have held on to their languages in private, whispered their people's prayers when the eunuchs weren't listening, told their children stories about the lands they came from. But the system was designed to outlast individual resistance. One generation might remember. The second would grow up between two worlds. By the third, the Old Kingdom was mythology, as distant as Atlantis, and the only real world was Persia. Vast, eternal, inescapable. The clay archive at Persepolis includes one fragment that haunts scholars. For the instruction of the king's sons who are born of foreign mothers in the proper observance of Persian customs and the Zoroastrian faith. It's a curriculum, a deliberate program of assimilation. These children of conquered peoples were being systematically converted into Persians, their mother's heritage treated as something to be corrected, like a flaw in marble that needed polishing away. When Alexander the Great burned Persepolis in 330 BCE, whether in drunken rage or calculated symbolism, historians still debate, the flames revealed frescoes that had been painted over. Beneath the official portraits of Persian queens, archaeologists found older images, women in Babylonian dress, in Median styles, in costumes that belonged to a dozen different conquered peoples. They'd been covered up, replaced with sanitized versions that looked more properly Persian. Even in art, the process of erasure was literal. The fire that destroyed Persepolis also preserved something the empire never meant to survive: thousands of clay tablets that had been hardened by the flames rather than destroyed. These administrative records, meant to be temporary, became permanent, and in them we see the empire's machinery stripped of its ceremonial grandeur. A woman from Lydia receives rations. A child of mixed birth is noted for special instruction. A former queen is listed simply as woman of the king's house from Egypt. The bureaucracy reduced human lives to line items, and in doing so, accidentally preserved what the monuments tried to erase. Stand today where the gate of all nations once welcomed envoys from the world's edges. The stone bulls still stand, their human faces weathered but watchful. Behind them, the audience hall lies in ruins, its columns toppled, its roof burned away by Alexander's fire or time's patient erosion. And beyond that, where the harem once stood, there's almost nothing. A few foundation stones, some fragments of walls. The part of the palace where so much of the empire's future was actually determined has left almost no trace. Perhaps that's fitting. The harem's power always lay in its invisibility, in the way it reshaped the world without being seen. Every prince who spoke Persian carried his mother's conquered language in his blood, but not his mouth. Every dynasty that bent the knee did so knowing their daughters might bear the next generation of Persian rulers, their grandchildren loyal to the throne that had defeated their grandfathers. The conquest was written into DNA, into family trees that branched across the empire like roots breaking stone. This is what made Persia different from Rome, from Egypt, from every other empire that rose and fell in that ancient world. Rome conquered with legions and law, imposing order from above. Egypt convinced the conquered they'd always been part of the kingdom, that the pharaoh was their father regardless of what language they spoke. But Persia understood that the most complete conquest was biological and cultural at once. to take a people's children and make them forget they were ever anything but Persian. The women who entered the harem carried their people's futures in their wombs. What emerged, generation after generation, were children who looked at their mothers' homelands as foreign territory, who had no stake in their grandfathers' lost kingdoms, who were Persian in every way that mattered. The empire reproduced itself through their bodies, each birth a small death of whatever came before. At sunset, Persepolis breathes memory, the echo of silk, the hush of lost tongues. Queens without names once walked these halls, their children taught to forget the songs of their mothers. Persia's victory was not in conquest, but in transformation, turning memory into silence. The cliff at Behistun still bears Darius's boast, but the women's voices are gone. Only an ivory comb remains, its carved face scraped away. Anger, ritual, or grief, no one knows. It holds the empire's truth, not destruction, but erasure. Not death, but the slow forgetting of who they once were.